In the middle of a winter diamond auction in Manhattan, billionaire Amelia Grant placed a stone worth $80 million on the table and gave an order that made the entire room go still. She wanted it cut in 5 minutes. No expert in the building dared to touch it because a single miscalculation could destroy a fortune in an instant. When the crowd began to mock the maintenance worker standing quietly near the display case, a man in a gray uniform stepped forward, asked for a loupe, and studied the stone in silence. 5 minutes later, his cut exposed something hidden inside the diamond that made the entire room forget how to breathe. The winter auction at Sterling House unfolded inside a glass-walled hall on the top floor of a Manhattan tower, where more than 200 investors, collectors, and journalists had gathered to witness the sale of a stone called the Aurora Legacy. The blue diamond, weighing over 60 carats, had once belonged to Evelyn Grant, Amelia's late mother, and its insured value stood at $80 million. Amelia announced that the proceeds would fund an expansion of her family's research foundation, though almost no one in that room knew the truth behind her calm smile. Grant Crown, the jewelry empire she had inherited, was quietly drowning in debt, and this single auction was the last thread holding the company together. Mason Reed moved through the crowd unnoticed, dressed in a gray maintenance uniform, carrying a worn toolbox as he checked the refrigeration units that kept the display cases cold. He paused near the Aurora Legacy longer than his work required, and something about the light bending through the stone caught his attention, a tiny broken rhythm that most eyes would never register. A security guard told him to step back, and a few guests laughed at the sight of a repairman staring at a diamond as though he understood it better than the experts standing beside him. Mason said nothing. He simply noted the position of the cameras, the mechanism of the display lock, and the transport case that Adrian Blake, the company's chief financial officer, kept close to his side. Before the bidding could begin, Grace Morgan, a fraud investigator brought in to certify the stone, ran a final spectral scan, and the fluorescence readings came back slightly inconsistent with the decade-old archive on file. Adrian quickly explained the discrepancy away as a difference in scanning equipment, and Amelia, unwilling to delay an auction she could not afford to lose, chose to believe him. Mason overheard the exchange from a few feet away, and something in his expression made clear that he understood the problem had nothing to do with outdated machinery. The diamond resting under the lights of Sterling House might not have been the same stone that once belonged to Evelyn Grant, and Mason, more than anyone else in that room, seemed to already know it. Just before the bidding could formally open, a collector named Lucas Bennett rose from his seat and declared publicly that the stone might be counterfeit. He presented an old analysis showing that the Aurora Legacy had always carried a small crescent-shaped inclusion near its base, a natural flaw that failed to appear anywhere in the live footage being projected onto the screens above the stage. The hall dissolved into chaos within seconds. Buyers demanded a recheck. Reporters began transmitting the story of a possible fraud at Grant Crown before Amelia had even left her chair, and the insurance representative overseeing the sale gave her only a few minutes to prove the stone's authenticity or lose her certification entirely. Joseph Hale, a celebrated master jeweler once responsible for training the country's finest cutters, proposed opening a tiny inspection window at a marked point on the stone's surface, a technique that would normally require hours of careful preparation rather than the few frantic minutes now available. Attempting it too quickly risked sending a fracture along the internal stress lines, destroying most of the diamond's value and, with it, whatever remained of Grant Crown's credibility. No certified expert in the room was willing to accept that kind of responsibility, and backed into a corner with cameras rolling, Amelia announced that whoever could complete the inspection cut within 5 minutes should step forward immediately, because losing the certification now meant losing the company itself. In the silence that followed, Mason spoke up and said quietly but clearly that the position Joseph had marked was wrong. Every head in the hall turned toward the man in the maintenance uniform, and Adrian, unable to resist a jab, asked whether Mason intended to fix an $80 million diamond with a wrench. Mason pointed to a spot near the diamond's girdle and explained that the stress lines were running in the opposite direction from what the archived schematics suggested, and that if the laser struck the point Joseph had chosen, the stone would split into 3 pieces within seconds. Joseph leaned in, studied the angle Mason described, and felt the color drain from his face as he realized the maintenance worker was right. Amelia asked who he was, and Mason answered only that he had once done this kind of work. Though nothing about him inspired confidence at first glance, Amelia had run out of better options, and she ordered the cutting room opened, giving Mason exactly 5 minutes to prove himself or destroy what little chance she had left. The moment the Aurora Legacy was secured into the laser cutting station, every screen in the auction hall switched to a live feed of Mason's hands. He removed his work gloves, washed his hands carefully, and adjusted the clamp with movements so fast and precise that Joseph immediately recognized the technique of a student he had once trained years earlier. Adrian slipped quietly away from his position, sent a brief message to someone unseen, and instructed a member of security to be ready to cut the power if anything went wrong. Mason studied the stone through a polarizing lens and noticed two zones of refraction inside that did not match, as though the diamond had been assembled from two materials with nearly identical optical properties. With less than 2 minutes remaining, he changed his cutting angle entirely, and Amelia, mistaking his hesitation for fear, ordered him to continue immediately. Mason told her, without raising his voice, that if she wanted to save the stone, she needed to stop giving orders for the next 2 minutes. For the first time in years, Amelia found herself handing complete control of a situation to a stranger she barely knew, and something about his steadiness made her comply. Mason activated the laser at a reduced power setting, tracing a thin guide path instead of cutting directly through the stone, then used a microscopic diamond-tipped blade to open a small inspection window along the horizontal plane. When the countdown reached fewer than 10 seconds, the window was complete, and the diamond had not fractured. Yet as light passed through the freshly opened surface, it revealed something no one in that room expected: an artificial seam running through the internal structure of the stone. Using a fine pair of tweezers, Mason extracted a thin sliver of material hidden inside a sealed compartment, a piece of optical polymer embedded with a numeric code and a microchip. The Aurora Legacy displayed before the crowd was not entirely a natural diamond at all, but an intricate composite built from lab-grown material fused with a specialized coating. On the back of the microchip was an inventory code belonging to Grant Crown itself, proof that the counterfeit stone had been manufactured from somewhere deep inside Amelia's own company. The hall fell into complete silence. Joseph stepped into the cutting room and told the crowd that Mason had once been the finest student he had ever trained, a young man who had held the national record for precision cutting at the American Gemological Institute. 7 years earlier, Mason had been responsible for a legendary stone called the Crimson Star, part of the original Grant Crown collection, and shortly after his shift ended, the diamond was found cracked and later discovered to have been swapped entirely. Mason was blamed for the disaster even though the security footage from that night had mysteriously disappeared. His professional certification was revoked, his clients vanished overnight, and the press turned him into a symbol of fraud within the gem industry. When the scandal broke, his wife had been undergoing treatment for a serious illness, and the loss of his job meant the loss of their insurance as well. Mason sold their home and everything they owned to cover her medical bills, yet in the end he lost her anyway and he was left to raise their daughter completely on his own. After that, Mason refused to return to the world of jewelry, choosing instead a quiet job in building maintenance where no one would recognize his name or ask about his past. His daughter appeared only briefly in his thoughts that day, through a short phone call before the auction, in which she asked when he would be home for dinner, and he promised he would not be late. That small promise revealed more about him than any credential ever could, showing that his deepest priority had nothing to do with reputation and everything to do with the child waiting for him at home. Standing in the crowd, Amelia suddenly remembered that Adrian had been the one overseeing security and inventory during the Crimson Star incident all those years ago, and that he had also been the one who quietly advised her father not to investigate too deeply, in order to protect the company's public image. Mason did not accuse Adrian outright. Instead, he asked to inspect the weight of the Aurora Legacy's transport case and compare it against the storage facility's sensor logs. And Grace confirmed that the case had been opened 3 separate times within the last 48 hours, though the system had only registered 2 of those openings as authorized. The third and unregistered access had used Adrian's high-level administrative code. Lucas Bennett, the collector who had first raised the alarm, watched the unfolding chaos from the edge of the crowd, quietly satisfied that his instincts about the stone had been proven correct, though even he had no idea how deep the deception truly ran. Reporters pressed closer to the roped-off cutting station, their cameras capturing every flicker of expression on Amelia's face as the foundation of her family's legacy seemed to crumble in real time. Somewhere behind the polished marble columns of the hall, a member of the insurance team quietly began drafting language for a formal fraud referral, a document that could end Grant Crown's standing with every underwriter in the industry for years to come. Adrian responded by declaring that Mason had prepared the counterfeit diamond in advance as an act of revenge against Grant Crown, using the maintenance worker's damaged past to turn public suspicion against him instead. Amelia found herself caught between two impossible choices: either trust the executive who had served her family loyally for 15 years, or trust the stranger her own company had once destroyed. She ordered the entire building sealed and the auction suspended indefinitely while the truth was sorted out. Grace worked alongside building security to secure every exit, and no one, regardless of status, was permitted to leave Sterling House until the investigation concluded. Camera records showed that Adrian had never personally carried the diamond out of the storage vault himself, which raised the unsettling possibility that he had an accomplice working somewhere inside the building. Examining the transport case more closely, Mason discovered traces of tungsten dust near the hinge, a material typically found in stage lifting mechanisms rather than anywhere near a diamond vault. Grace ran the tungsten residue through a portable analyzer, while Mason paced the length of the storage room, mentally retracing every cart, every technician, and every door that had opened during the final hours before the auction began. Amelia watched him work, struck by how differently he approached the problem compared to the executives and consultants she had relied on for years, none of whom had ever paused to consider that the answer might be hiding in something as unglamorous as a cleaning cart. From that single clue, Mason reasoned that the real stone was still somewhere inside the building, since smuggling an object marked with a microscopic radioactive tracer past modern security checkpoints would have been nearly impossible. The safest method for the thief would have been hiding it inside equipment that was already authorized to move freely through the venue. He examined the base of the auction display table and found its structure weighed nearly 70 grams more than the original engineering specifications allowed. When they removed a metal panel underneath, they discovered a hidden compartment, empty except for faint traces suggesting the diamond had been stored there and moved only minutes earlier. Security footage placed Joseph near the stage shortly before the auction began, and Adrian immediately accused the old master jeweler of being Mason's accomplice in the entire scheme. Joseph confessed that he had discovered the hidden compartment himself, but had never taken the stone, planning instead to report it directly to Amelia, until he received a photograph of his own home along with a clear threat attached to it. He admitted, with visible shame, that he had also stayed silent during the Crimson Star scandal 7 years earlier because Adrian had used the exact same method of intimidation against him then. Mason recalled a maintenance cart that had appeared in the hallway despite no scheduled repairs, and traced it down to the refrigeration unit in the basement, where extremely low temperatures could temporarily disable the diamond's identification signature. Amelia and Grace followed Mason down into the lower levels of the building, and there, tucked inside a ventilation duct, they found a case containing what appeared to be the real Aurora Legacy. The moment Mason pulled it free, the fire suppression system activated without warning, sealing every fire door in the basement and trapping the three of them inside a room rapidly filling with mist and losing oxygen. Someone was watching them from the control room, deliberately manipulating the building's systems against them. Inside that sealed chamber, Mason remained calm, located a secondary control panel, and guided Amelia and Grace safely through a narrow service corridor before the air ran too thin to breathe. In that moment, Amelia understood something about Mason that no headline or accusation could have taught her. When danger surrounded them, he had focused entirely on getting the people around him to safety rather than protecting an $80 million stone. A quiet trust began forming between them, built not on words but on the simple fact that Mason had chosen people over profit without a second of hesitation. When Amelia returned to the main hall, she found that Adrian had already declared her unfit to continue managing the crisis, invoking an emergency clause to have the board suspend her authority immediately. He pointed to the diamond recovered from the maintenance level as evidence that Mason had staged the entire disaster from the beginning, and several board members, quietly bribed long before that night, sided with him without hesitation. Grace, working independently, uncovered records showing that Grant Crown had borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars from funds secretly connected to Adrian himself. If the auction collapsed, the company's stock would crash, triggering a debt conversion clause that would allow Adrian to seize a controlling share of the business. His plan had never been simply to steal one diamond. He intended to strip Amelia of her company entirely, then buy back its remaining assets for almost nothing once the value collapsed. The counterfeit Aurora Legacy had been engineered specifically to pass ordinary inspection, and once Amelia sold it publicly, the eventual discovery of the fraud would leave her facing criminal charges rather than him. Mason noticed that the stone recovered from the ventilation duct carried an unusually low temperature but lacked the characteristic scratch pattern near its crown, and he concluded almost immediately that this, too, was a second counterfeit rather than the genuine article. He deliberately announced, loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, that he had found the real Aurora Legacy and intended to hand it over to the police, betting that Adrian would be forced to check on the true hiding place before the building could be searched completely. While Grace quietly restored footage from an old service corridor camera that had gone unnoticed for years, Amelia pretended to accept the transfer of authority to Adrian, giving him just enough false confidence to make his next move. Adrian slipped into a records room that had once belonged to Evelyn Grant, opened an antique clock that had sat untouched for years, and removed a small metal case hidden inside its mechanism. Mason, Amelia, and Grace stepped out of the shadows to confront him, and whatever composure Adrian had maintained all evening finally shattered. He held the metal case above his head and threatened to drop it into a nearby waste compactor if anyone came closer, confessing in the same breath that the entire Crimson Star affair years earlier had merely been a test run. Mason had been chosen as the scapegoat precisely because he was too skilled, too principled, and too capable of noticing the very network of fraud Adrian had spent years building. Adrian hurled the case into a maintenance chute and fled down the corridor, but instead of chasing him, Mason went after the falling case itself. He forced his way into the freight lift mechanism, jammed the gears using a maintenance bar, and managed to stop the case just inches away from the industrial compactor blades below. Meanwhile, Grace and building security cornered Adrian near the elevator lobby before he could reach an exit. When the case was finally opened, the real Aurora Legacy lay inside, its crescent-shaped inclusion exactly matching the decades-old records everyone had trusted from the start. Alongside the dimes sat a small data drive containing a detailed record of dozens of similar substitutions Adrian had orchestrated over the years across the industry. The data drive revealed that Adrian had once swapped the Crimson Star for an inferior stone and then quietly altered the security logs to place all blame squarely on Mason. The proceeds from that original theft had been funneled into a web of shell companies, and Adrian had gone on to apply the exact same method to numerous other assets belonging to Grant Crown over the following years. Investigators from the district attorney's office arrived within the hour, sealing off the records room and cataloging every document Adrian had left behind in his hurried escape. Detectives spent days tracing the shell companies listed on the data drive, uncovering a pattern of substitutions stretching back nearly a decade across 4 different auction houses, not just Grant Crown. Several other victims came forward once the story broke, former cutters and appraisers who had lost their careers under circumstances eerily similar to Mason's own, each one having assumed for years that they alone had been unlucky enough to be blamed for someone else's crime. Joseph gave a full statement detailing the threats he had endured, and Grace located an archived copy of the missing security footage buried inside an old insurance database that had never been fully deleted. The recovered footage clearly showed Adrian switching the case containing the Crimson Star only moments after Mason had left the cutting room 7 years earlier. Amelia stood in stunned silence as she realized her own father had once had the chance to investigate the Crimson Star scandal properly but had chosen instead to protect the company's public image at any cost. That single decision had cost Mason his career, his savings, and ultimately the final years he might have had with his wife. Standing before the remaining guests and members of the press, Amelia offered Mason a public apology, but he made it clear that a simple apology could never be enough. He told her plainly that although she had not personally orchestrated the scheme that destroyed his life, she was still benefiting from a system that had crushed people with no power to defend themselves. He asked her to disclose the entire affair publicly, compensate every other victim buried beneath years of silence, and abandon any temptation to bury the truth simply to protect the company's stock price. Members of the board warned Amelia that a full public disclosure could bankrupt Grant Crown entirely, putting thousands of employees at risk of losing their jobs overnight. She stood at the exact crossroads her father had once faced, forced to choose between protecting the family name or protecting the truth, and unlike him, she chose the truth without hesitation. She called an impromptu press conference right there in the auction hall, admitted publicly that the Aurora legacy had been fraudulently substituted, and released every piece of evidence gathered against Adrian to the reporters still filming inside the building. She pledged to fund an independent audit of the entire company, sell a significant portion of her personal assets to protect employee wages during the fallout, and personally compensate every victim identified in Adrian's long history of fraud. Grace confirmed publicly that it was Mason who had uncovered the entire scheme, and Joseph, in front of the cameras, admitted his own years of silence with visible regret. The American Gemological Institute issued a formal statement restoring Mason's revoked certification and permanently clearing his name of every accusation from 7 years earlier. Yet Mason did not celebrate the way everyone around him expected him to. He said quietly that a piece of paper could never return the 7 years that had already been taken from him. What mattered to him now was making certain that no other nameless craftsman would ever again be sacrificed simply because they lacked the power to defend themselves. Adrian was arrested on charges of fraud, theft, extortion, and stock manipulation, and several board members who had quietly accepted his bribes soon found themselves under investigation as well. As he was led away in handcuffs, he mocked Amelia, telling her she had just destroyed her own family's empire with her own hands. She answered without hesitation that an empire built entirely on lies deserved to fall apart long before that night ever happened. 3 months later, Grant Crown had suffered enormous financial losses, though it had not collapsed entirely. Amelia sold her private jet, several properties, and much of her personal jewelry collection to establish a compensation fund for everyone Adrian had harmed over the years. She dismissed the old board completely, appointed Grace to lead a newly independent compliance division, and built a full traceability system to track the origin of every stone the company handled going forward. The Aurora legacy itself was never sold. Amelia donated it to a museum instead, along with the complete and unedited story of the fraud in every person who had been hurt because of it. Reporters called him repeatedly during those first weeks, hoping for interviews, statements, or even a single photograph they could sell to magazines eager for a redemption story. And each time Mason declined politely, choosing instead to pick his daughter up from school and keep dinner on the table at the same hour it had always been. Mason returned to his maintenance job, and even though his name had been fully cleared, he had little desire to step back into the world of diamonds, a world too closely tied to everything he had lost. Amelia came to see him alone one afternoon without an assistant or a security escort and offered him the position of technical director at a newly formed independent certification institute funded by Grant Crown but free of any real influence from the company itself. Mason turned down the substantial salary and the ownership stake she offered, explaining plainly that he had no interest in becoming a public symbol for the very company that had once destroyed him. Rather than trying to win him over with money, Amelia handed him a written plan for a free training program aimed at struggling young diamond cutters, along with a formal system designed to protect whistleblowers within the industry. Mason agreed to consider the offer, but only under 3 conditions. The Certification Institute would have to remain entirely independent from Grant Crown's influence. Every future violation uncovered, no matter who was implicated, would have to be made fully public without exception. And a portion of all profits would need to directly support the families of workers who had been treated unfairly throughout the jewelry trade for years. Amelia accepted every condition without argument, and the relationship that slowly grew between them was built on quiet respect rather than any sudden or unrealistic change of heart. Amelia came to understand that Mason would always place his family and his own peace above wealth or status, while Mason recognized that Amelia was genuinely trying to repair what had been broken rather than simply protecting her public image. His daughter appeared only briefly again, glimpsed through a single dinner mentioned in passing, where Amelia caught her first real look at the simple, quiet life Mason had worked so hard to protect all along. The months leading up to that opening were far from easy. Grant Crown's stock took nearly a year to stabilize, and several longtime clients quietly withdrew their business, unwilling to be associated with a company still recovering from scandal, no matter how transparent its new leadership claimed to be. Amelia spent long nights reviewing every contract, every vendor relationship, and every certification the company had ever issued, determined never again to sign her name to something she had not personally verified. Mason, for his part, spent those same months quietly interviewing young cutters from community colleges and trade schools across the Northeast. searching for the kind of overlooked talent that reminded him of himself 20 years earlier, before the world had ever tested what he was made of. A year later, the newly established Reed Grant Institute opened its doors in New York, training a new generation of young diamond cutters based purely on skill rather than family name or connections. Mason became its technical director, yet he never abandoned the simple, grounded way he had always lived, no longer hiding from his past but never allowing his renewed reputation to change who he truly was. She replaced the glass and marble of the old executive floor with an open workspace where every employee, from the newest apprentice to the head of compliance, could see exactly how decisions were made and why. Amelia rebuilt Grant Crown into a smaller company, one with far less influence than before but with genuine transparency at its core, and for the first time in her life, she felt she was running a business actually worth preserving. She asked Mason to perform one final cut on the Aurora legacy, not to increase its market value but to transform it into a symbol of a genuine new beginning. The gallery Amelia chose for the unveiling sat 2 blocks from the very tower where the auction had once nearly destroyed her, a deliberate choice she never explained to the reporters who asked. Joseph attended the ceremony as well, older now and quieter, watching from the back row as the student he had once failed to protect took his place at the center of a story finally told honestly. Grace stood near the entrance, having left her career in fraud investigation behind to join Mason's new institute full-time, convinced that preventing the next scandal mattered more than chasing the last one. Mason opened a small additional facet at the exact spot that concealed the diamond's crescent-shaped inclusion, and rather than eliminating the flaw entirely, he allowed the light to pass directly through it, creating a unique halo of refracted color that had never existed in the stone before. He explained, in his usual quiet way, that a scar did not always diminish an object's worth and that sometimes a scar was simply proof that something had survived. The Aurora legacy was placed on permanent display under a new name, presented to the public simply as the Truth Stone. The plaque beside it made no mention of Amelia's name or its $80 million valuation. It told only the story of a craftsman who had been abandoned by an entire industry, yet still chose to save a diamond that once belonged to the very people who had ruined him. Photographers who had once crowded around Amelia for very different reasons now stood at a respectful distance, capturing images of a woman who looked, for the first time in years, genuinely at peace rather than merely composed for the cameras. Mason's daughter attended the ceremony too, seated quietly in the second row in a plain blue dress, watching her father speak with a kind of pride that no courtroom victory or press release could have given her earlier. Amelia stood beside Mason at the opening ceremony, and amid the quiet applause, she asked him why he had ever stepped up to that cutting table on the day of the auction, knowing he might be blamed all over again. Mason looked at the diamond glowing softly under the gallery lights and answered, without a trace of bitterness, that he had never stepped forward that day to save a billionaire's fortune. He had stepped forward because he understood, more deeply than anyone else in that room ever could, exactly what it felt like to watch the truth get crushed in silence. As the story came to its close, light passed once more through the small scar cut into the Aurora legacy, casting a halo across the gallery walls that had never appeared in the stone before that night. A quiet reminder that what people carry beneath the surface often shines brighter than anything the world once judged them for.